People come to San Diego for the sunshine, for the 60 miles of coastline, the Pacific breeze, the promise of a clean, golden life on the edge of the American dream. And on the surface, it delivers every single time. The postcards never lie about the beaches. The tourism brochures never exaggerate the weather. San Diego is, by almost every visible measure, paradise. But paradise has a way of hiding things. Beneath the manicured streets of Old Town, beneath the humming freeways and the glittering bayfront, beneath the badge and the uniform and the civic pride, the city has been carrying stories that most people were never meant to know. Stories of executions that echo through generations, of children who vanished one summer and were never given justice, of a monster in a patrol car who drove under the cover of law, of an old cemetery that was quite literally paved over, its dead sealed beneath asphalt and left to rot in silence, and of a killing spree so vast, so politically tangled, and so aggressively buried that it took years just to acknowledge it was real. This is not the San Diego of the travel brochures. This is the city underneath it. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. San Diego calls itself America's finest city. It earned that name from its climate, its coastline, its promise of peace. But cities do not get to choose which stories are told about them. History has a way of surfacing, even when it is supposed to stay buried, sometimes literally. In the oldest neighborhood in the city, a house has stood on a site where a man was slowly strangled to death by a rope long before the first brick was ever laid. The family that built their home there never entirely recovered, and neither, it seems, did the house itself. In the summer of 1976, 3 children disappeared from the streets of San Diego County within a span of weeks. They were found in ditches and ravines, bludgeoned, assaulted, discarded. Almost 50 years later, no one has been brought to justice, not a single person. On a cold December night in 1986, a 20-year-old college student pulled off a freeway after being flagged down by a man she believed she could trust. She was never seen alive again. The man who flagged her down had done it before, to other women on the same stretch of road. Nobody had stopped him. In the heart of Old Town, there is a quiet cemetery where the dead were buried with a prayer for rest. They did not get it. The city eventually paved a road through the graveyard. 18 to 20 bodies are still down there, beneath the pavement. People park their cars right on top of them, and running beneath all of it, through the 1980s, was a killing spree so enormous, more than 40 women murdered across San Diego County, that investigators initially could not agree it was even happening. The first victim had testified against police officers just 5 weeks before her body was found on a mountain road. Her autopsy report was classified. It has never been fully released to the public. 5 stories, 1 city, the same city where the sun shines every day. Story 1, the Gallows House. The dark history of the Whaley House before Thomas Whaley ever laid a single brick, before the floorboards were cut or the windows hung. A man had already died on that exact piece of earth. Died slowly, died badly, and the people who watched said his legs kept moving for a long time after. Thomas Whaley knew about the execution. He bought the property anyway. What happened inside that house over the next century and a half has never been fully explained. Old Town, San Diego, 1852. The city is barely a city. It is a frontier outpost, sun-baked, rough-edged, full of merchants and sailors and men who had come west with gold dust in their eyes. The rule of law was still being improvised. And in this half-formed place, public executions served as both justice and entertainment. The site that would one day become 2476 San Diego Avenue was, at the time, the location of the town's gallows. A wooden scaffold, open to the sky, where convicted criminals were hanged in view of whoever wanted to watch. It was a practical arrangement. And in the late summer of 1852, it was about to be used on a man named James Robinson, known to everyone in Old Town by his street name, Yankee Jim. James Robinson was a large man, described by accounts of the era as tall, broad-shouldered, and difficult to intimidate. He had come to California during the gold rush, as thousands of others had, chasing the promise of a different life. What he found instead was trouble. In the summer of 1852, he was convicted of grand larceny, specifically the theft of a boat. Whether that charge reflected everything Robinson had actually done, or whether frontier justice was already running ahead of the evidence, the historical record does not clearly say. On September 18, 1852, Yankee Jim Robinson was led to the Old Town gallows. He was convicted. The scaffold was ready. The rope was placed around his neck. And here is where history turns uncomfortable in a very specific way. Robinson was a tall man. Too tall, apparently, for the gallows that had been constructed. When the trap door opened, his feet found the ground, or something close to it. He did not die quickly, as an efficient hanging was supposed to accomplish. Instead, he strangled, slowly, for an extended period of time, by multiple historical accounts, while the crowd watched. It was, by any measure, a grotesque and prolonged death. 3 years later, in 1855, a successful businessman named Thomas Whaley purchased that same piece of land. He was fully aware of its history. He began construction anyway, and by 1857, had built what would become the first two-story brick structure in Southern California, a handsome Greek revival house where he intended to raise his family. Almost immediately, something appeared to be wrong. Thomas Whaley himself, not a ghost hunter, not a sensationalist, but a practical San Diego businessman, reported hearing heavy footsteps moving through the house. Deliberate, pacing. The sound, he told people, reminded him of the heavy boots of a large man walking slowly through the upper rooms. He was not a man given to flights of imagination, but he wrote about those sounds. His family heard them too. Then the tragedies began accumulating inside the house itself, with a frequency that struck those who knew the family as deeply unusual. The Whaley's first son, Thomas Jr., died of scarlet fever inside the home at just 18 months old. Shortly after, a fire gutted the general store Thomas Whaley had opened within the house, financially devastating him. The family left for San Francisco. When they returned years later, the misfortune continued. In 1871, while Thomas was away on business, a group of armed men forced their way in and held Anna Whaley at gunpoint, seizing the county courthouse records the family had been keeping there. The family's sense of safety was never quite the same, but the worst was still coming. On August 18, 1885, Violet Whaley, one of Thomas and Anna's daughters, shot herself in the chest inside the family home. She was in her mid-20s, recently divorced from a marriage that had been publicly humiliating and had fallen into deep depression. The suicide was documented in the historical record. It happened. It is not legend. What is harder to classify is what people have reported in the house ever since. The footsteps that Thomas Whaley himself described, the heavy, deliberate pacing of what sounded like a large man, have been reported by visitors, workers, and investigators for more than a century after his death. The second floor of the house, where Violet spent her final weeks, is routinely described by visitors as carrying a feeling of suffocating sadness, quite distinct from the rest of the building. The U.S. Commerce Department officially recognized the Whaley House as a haunted location, one of only 2 such designations in the country at the time the recognition was made. The Travel Channel, the Discovery Channel, and numerous paranormal investigation programs have featured the property. Ghost hunting groups have recorded anomalous temperature drops and electronic interference throughout the building. None of these constitute scientific proof of anything supernatural, but the sheer consistency of the reports, spanning decades and involving thousands of separate witnesses, raises questions that a simple dismissal of superstition cannot entirely answer. What is documented fact? A man was publicly strangled to death on this land. A family built a home there and suffered repeated tragedy inside it. The footsteps Thomas Whaley himself described have been reported by unconnected strangers for 160 years. What remains unexplained is what, exactly, is making those sounds. Perhaps the most unsettling detail of the Whaley House story is not any single paranormal claim. It is the simple historical coincidence at the center of it all. Thomas Whaley was a rational man. He was a businessman. He knew what had happened on that land. He chose to build his home there, raise his children there, grow old there. And then, one by one, the people he loved most died there. His infant son, his daughter. Eventually, Thomas and Anna themselves, on the same property. And all the while, by his own written account, those heavy footsteps kept moving through the upper rooms. Yankee Jim Robinson strangled to death on the gallows in 1852. Thomas Whaley built his house there in 1857, the last living member of the family to occupy the home left in 1953. That is almost exactly 100 years of a single family, living with the sound of something they could never explain. Today, the Whaley House operates as a museum and is open to the public. It has been featured in more documented paranormal investigations than almost any other residential structure in the United States. The house has been continuously maintained and restored. Thousands of people tour it every year. The grave of Yankee Jim Robinson has never been definitively located. Brass historical markers designate the area near the house where the gallows once stood. The location of the execution and the location of the family home are essentially the same place. Thomas Whaley's own journal entries about the footsteps are preserved in historical archives. They are not legend. They are his words in his handwriting. Whatever produced those sounds, he heard them. He lived with them. He never found an explanation that satisfied him. The house is still there. The footsteps, by a remarkable number of independent accounts, still are too. Story 2, the city paved over its dead, El Campo Santo Cemetery. Somewhere beneath the pavement where you are parking your car, there is a body. Not metaphorically, not as an expression, a literal human body in the earth with a name, or what remains of a name, buried under asphalt because a city needed a road and decided that the living mattered more than the dead. This happened in San Diego. It happened in public. And the city did not try very hard to pretend otherwise. El Campo Santo, the Holy Field. Established in 1849 as a Catholic cemetery in the heart of what was then a thriving frontier community, it served as the final resting place for San Diego's earliest settlers. Mexican citizens, Native Americans, Catholic pioneers, gamblers, outlaws, civic leaders, and children, all buried side by side in the sun-hardened earth of Old Town. For 30 years, El Campo Santo was where San Diego sent its dead. By the time it was officially closed to new burials in 1880, approximately 477 graves had been documented within its walls. The real number is almost certainly higher. Record-keeping in a frontier cemetery was imperfect, and not everyone who was buried there was considered worth recording. Then, the city started to grow, and growth, in San Diego as everywhere else, required roads. In 1889, a horse-drawn streetcar line was proposed to run through Old Town. The city needed a route. The most direct route went straight through a section of El Campo Santo Cemetery. City planners made their calculation. The streetcar line was built directly through the graveyard. A number of bodies were exhumed and relocated. A number were not. The records of which graves were properly moved and which were simply paved over are incomplete. A remarkable fact for a city that prided itself on civic organization. By 1942, the horse-drawn streetcar had long since been replaced by automobiles, and the old streetcar path had been converted into San Diego Avenue. Modern asphalt was laid over the ground where the streetcar had run, and somewhere in the process, somewhere in the transition from one century's infrastructure to the next, the remaining graves were simply sealed beneath the road. The city eventually acknowledged this. Archaeological surveys conducted in the 20th century confirmed that a significant number of human remains were still in the earth beneath what is now San Diego Avenue. Small brass markers were subsequently embedded in the sidewalk and street outside the cemetery's current fence line, each one designating a known burial location. If you walk along the sidewalk beside El Campo Santo today, you are walking over those markers, and beneath those markers, there are people. The documented facts of what was done to El Campo Santo are disturbing enough on their own, but the history of the cemetery holds one additional element that is frequently overlooked in the ghost tour version of the story. Among the confirmed burials in El Campo Santo is that of Antonio Garra, a Cupeño Native American leader who had organized a resistance against American taxation of indigenous peoples in the early 1850s. Cara was captured, tried, and sentenced to death. On January 10, 1852, he was executed by a firing squad at El Campo Santo, shot next to his own open grave, into which his body then fell. It was a particularly brutal piece of frontier justice, carried out on a man whose only documented crime was organizing his people to resist what he considered an unjust law. Cara was buried where he fell. His grave, like many others, was eventually absorbed into the physical footprint of the city that had killed him. What makes El Campo Santo genuinely strange is not the ghost stories, though those are reported with unusual consistency. What makes it strange is the behavior of the vehicles. For decades, drivers who parked their cars along the section of San Diego Avenue that runs over or adjacent to the submerged graves have reported inexplicable electrical malfunctions. Car alarms trigger without cause, headlights activate on their own, engines refuse to turn over, then start normally once the car has been moved to a different location. This has been reported so consistently and by so many unconnected people, residents, tourists, business owners, that it has become a documented phenomenon associated with the site. Skeptical explanations exist. The soil composition in the area may affect vehicle electronics. Electromagnetic interference from nearby equipment is possible. But these explanations have never been rigorously tested, and the reports continue. What is known, beyond any doubt, is that the bodies are there. The brass markers in the sidewalk confirm it. The archaeological surveys confirm it. Whatever you believe about what the dead can or cannot do, the city of San Diego paved a road through its own cemetery, left the bodies where they were, and has been parking cars on top of them ever since. In 1993, the city of San Diego installed those small brass markers in the sidewalk, an official acknowledgement, in the most understated way possible, that people were buried beneath the road. Each marker is flush with the pavement, easy to miss, easy to walk over without noticing. The oldest and most disquieting part of the El Campo Santo story is not the car alarms, not the apparitions that visitors describe in period clothing near the cemetery gates. It is the institutional calculation that was made in 1889 that the needs of a streetcar line outweighed the sanctity of a burial ground, that some of the dead were worth moving and some were not, and that 100 years later, the city's answer to what it had done was to put a small metal disc in the sidewalk and call it acknowledgement. El Campo Santo is still in existence today, still visible behind its white wooden fence in the heart of Old Town San Diego State Historic Park. The known graves within the fence are maintained. The unknown and paved-over graves beneath the street are not and cannot be, as removing them would require dismantling a functioning city road. Archaeological and historical researchers have continued to study the site. The brass markers remain in the sidewalk, and the electrical anomalies, the car alarms, the dead batteries, the lights that turn themselves on, continue to be reported by visitors who have no prior knowledge of the cemetery's history before they arrive. Antonio. Cara was executed and buried there in 1852. The city that executed him eventually drove a road through his grave. That is not a ghost story. That is a documented historical fact. The brass markers are there if you know to look for them. Small circles of metal set into the sidewalk, each one marking something that cannot be moved, cannot be reclaimed, and cannot be given back. The city paved over its dead and called it progress. The dead, by a number of independent accounts, have not been entirely quiet about it. Story 3, The Summer of Terror, San Diego's Unsolved Child Murders of 1976. In the summer of 1976, children were disappearing from the sidewalks of San Diego County. Not from remote areas, not from places where a child had no business being, from their own neighborhoods, on ordinary afternoons, doing the ordinary things that children did in 1976, walking to the store, visiting a friend, picking up the evening newspaper for their grandmother. 3 children vanished. All 3 were found dead. All 3 have waited almost 50 years for justice. They are still waiting. San Diego County, summer of 1976, the bicentennial year. America was celebrating 200 years of itself. Parades, fireworks, a collective sense of national pride following the difficult years of Vietnam and Watergate. San Diego was a growing city, prosperous and sun-drenched, a place where families moved to give their children better lives. And somewhere within 20 miles of the city's center, someone was hunting those children. 3 victims, 3 separate incidents, 3 separate neighborhoods. The oldest was 14. The youngest was 9. All 3 disappeared within weeks of each other. All 3 were found in ditches and ravines and scrubland miles from where they were last seen. And all 3 were killed with a brutality that left the detectives who worked their cases haunted for the rest of their careers. The first child to disappear was David Clinton. Hobbs, he was 14 years old. On July 17, 1976, exactly 1 week after his 14th birthday, David told his mother he was walking to a nearby convenience store in the Golden Hill neighborhood. He was last seen after 10 in the evening, walking near the intersection of 30th Street and Euclid. He did not come back. 2 weeks later, on August 2nd, David's body was found off State Route 67, south of Poway Road. The medical examiner determined that he had been beaten with an iron rod and stabbed 15 times. He was found miles from his home. He had been killed somewhere else and brought there. Less than 2 weeks after David Hobbs was found, a 9-year-old girl named Aleta Sue Grossenbach vanished from the Bird Rock neighborhood on a Saturday afternoon. Aleta and her mother Judith were visiting from Illinois. Judith had grown up in San Diego and was considering moving back, wanting her daughter to grow up here. One of Aleta's daily chores during the visit was walking a block and a half to collect the evening newspaper from her grandmother's neighbor. On that Saturday afternoon, she left to do exactly that. She walked the block and a half and did not come back. 3 days later, on August 17th, Aleta Sue Grossenbach's body was found 30 feet down an embankment off Pomerado Road, thrown into the brush. She had been sexually assaulted and beaten to death. She was 9 years old. The third victim was 12-year-old Donald Whaley of Elkasian. On September 25th, 1976, Donald left his home to visit a girlfriend. He was last seen near the intersection of Marshall and Magnolia. He was reported missing, and police received more than 200 tips from people claiming to have spotted him, sightings ranging from San Clemente to Point Loma. Not one of them was accurate. On October 1st, 6 days after Donald disappeared, his body was found face down in a brush-covered drainage ditch 15 feet off Murphy Canyon Road, 10 miles from his house. The coroner concluded that Donald had almost certainly been killed soon after he was taken. He had been sexually assaulted and strangled. The geography of these 3 cases is what makes investigators most uncomfortable when they study them today. 3 children, 3 neighborhoods spread across San Diego County, within roughly 20 miles of one another. 3 disappearances across a span of approximately 10 weeks. 3 bodies found in rural or remote locations miles from where the victims were last seen. What connects them is the pattern. A child, alone on a familiar street, in daylight or early evening. Gone. Then found days later, discarded, with evidence of sexual violence. In the case of Aleta Sue Grossenbach, a woman eventually came forward in 1982 with a confession of sorts. Not her own confession, but a deathbed-adjacent one. She told police that her father, a registered sex offender named Louis Felton May Jr., who had died in a motorcycle accident in 1978, had confessed to her 2 weeks after Aleta's body was discovered. She had held that information for 6 years. Aleta's mother, Judith Grossenbach, refused to accept this conclusion. She believed it was an attempt to close a case that had become embarrassing for law enforcement. The case was never formally resolved. The cases of David Hobbs and Donald Whaley have no named suspects at all. 50 years later, every investigative lead has gone cold. San Diego County Sheriff's Cold Case detectives officially reopened these cases in 2024, applying modern DNA technology to physical evidence retained from the original investigations. Detective Brent Spencer, who leads the Cold Case Unit, publicly acknowledged the specific horror that these cases represent, not just in their brutality, but in what they reveal about the vulnerability of children in an era when the unspoken social contract was that kids could walk their own neighborhoods safely. The question, that cold case, investigators cannot stop asking is whether these 3 cases are connected. They share victimology, they share geography, They share a time frame. But the methods of killing differ. David Hobbs was beaten and stabbed. Donald Whaley was strangled. Aleta Sue Grossenbach was beaten. Investigators have described Hobbs and Whaley as sharing what they call similar victimology. Both were outgoing boys who regularly interacted with older individuals, making them potentially easier targets. But the differences in method have complicated the theory of a single perpetrator. Could it have been one killer, adapting his methods? Could it have been two or three separate predators, operating independently in the same county during the same summer? The investigation has never answered these questions. The thing that makes the Summer of Terror most genuinely disturbing is its silence. Not the silence of the perpetrators, though that has been absolute. The silence of nearly 50 years without justice. 3 families, what remains of them, waiting. 3 children buried with no killer ever held accountable. And somewhere, by statistical probability, the person or persons responsible either lived out their lives and died naturally, or are still alive today. Detective Spencer made his plea in 2024. If anyone knew anything, a family member's confession, a neighbor's passing admission, anything heard in those weeks and months and years after the summer of 1976, he wanted to hear it. Someone, somewhere, has carried this knowledge for close to half a century. As of 2025, all 3 cases remain officially open and unsolved. The San Diego County Sheriff's Cold Case Unit is actively pursuing DNA analysis of retained evidence. No arrests have been made in connection with any of the 3 murders. The families of David Clinton Hobbs, Aleta Sue Grossenbach, and Donald Whaley have never received definitive answers. Judith Grossenbach went to her grave believing that the explanation offered to her, the posthumous confession of a dead sex offender, was insufficient. Her daughter Aleta was 9 years old. She walked a block and a half to get the newspaper. She was gone in the time it took to walk that distance. The summer of 1976 ended. The fireworks from the bicentennial faded. The country moved on. San Diego moved on. 3 children did not. And somewhere, very quietly, whoever took them has been living with that knowledge ever since. Story 4. Badge of Betrayal. The murder of Cara Knott. She was driving home. 20 years old, a college student. A familiar stretch of freeway between her boyfriend's house and her parents' home. A drive she had made dozens of times. When the police lights came on behind her, she did the right thing. She pulled over. She trusted the uniform. That trust killed her. December 27, 1986. San Diego County, California. It was 2 days after Christmas. Cara Evelyn Knott, 20 years old, a student at San Diego State University, was southbound on Interstate 15, making the familiar drive from Escondido, where her boyfriend lived, back to her parents' home in El Cajon. It was evening. The freeway was quiet. Cara had her whole life in front of her. Craig Allen Pyer had been a California Highway Patrol officer for 13 years. He was well regarded within the CHP. He had a reputation as professional, helpful, the kind of officer the department pointed to with pride. He was working that night, and he had been doing something on that particular stretch of I-15 for quite some time before December 27, 1986. Something that should have been caught, and wasn't. Somewhere on Interstate 15, Craig Pyer activated his patrol car's emergency lights and directed Cara Knott off the freeway. He guided her down an isolated, unfinished off-ramp near the Mercy Road exit. A dead-end spur of road that went nowhere, that was not used, that was dark and separated from the main freeway flow. What happened on that dead-end road has been established through forensic evidence and trial testimony. Pyer, it emerged, had been using that same off-ramp to pull over female drivers for months, not for legitimate traffic violations, for his own purposes. Multiple women came forward after Cara's death to describe being directed to the same location by Pyer, who would then linger in their vehicles, stroke their hair, make comments that felt threatening without being technically explicit. They had been made deeply uncomfortable. Some had been genuinely frightened. None had reported him. He was a police officer. Who were they going to call? On the night of December 27th, something went differently than it had with the other women. Investigators believe that when Pyer made his advance toward Cara Knott, she fought back. She told him she would report him. The forensic evidence shows that she scratched at his face, hard enough to leave marks that were still visible on Pyer 2 days later when he appeared on local television. Craig Pyer bludgeoned Cara Knott with his police flashlight. He strangled her to death with a rope. He then carried her body to the Los Peñasquitos Creek Arch Bridge and threw her into the ravine 65 feet below, where her body landed in the brush. He returned to his patrol car and drove back onto the freeway. Cara Knott's body was discovered the following morning. What makes the Cara Knott case so deeply disturbing is not just the murder. It is the pattern of failures that made the murder possible. Multiple women had been directed to that same off-ramp by Pyer before Cara Knott died there. Multiple women had made complaints about his behavior. Those complaints were dismissed, or filed away, or handled in whatever way complaints about popular officers in good standing tend to get handled. The CHP had no formal record of concern about Pyer's conduct on that road. 2 days after Cara's body was found, 2 days, the very same Craig Pyer appeared on local San Diego television station KCST, participating in a ride-along segment about self-protection for female drivers. He was giving advice to women about how to stay safe, and he had visible scratches on his face. The kind of scratches, it would eventually be established, that were entirely consistent with a victim fighting for her life. The phone calls started almost immediately after the broadcast aired. Dozens of women called in to say that the officer on television was the same officer who had pulled them over on the same isolated off-ramp. Within days, the investigation had focused on Craig Pyer. The physical evidence assembled against Pyer was substantial. A gold rayon fiber from Cara Knott's dress matched Pyer's CHP uniform shoulder patch, a highly distinctive fiber produced using a yellow pigment rather than a standard dye, making it virtually impossible to explain away as coincidence. Microscopic purple fibers also connected him to the scene. A rope found in his patrol car was analyzed by a forensic dentist who concluded it was consistent with the rope marks on Cara Knott's neck, though that expert was ultimately barred from testifying in court on procedural grounds. Pyer's own logbook showed hasty, suspicious alterations around the time of the murder. A blood drop on one of Cara's boots matched Pyer's blood type, AB negative, the rarest type in existence, though conclusive DNA testing was not yet available in 1986. Despite all of this, the first trial ended in a hung jury. 7 jurors voted to convict, 5 did not. Craig Pyer walked out of the courthouse after that first trial as a free man, briefly. The second trial returned a guilty verdict. On August 4th, 1988, Craig Allen Pyer was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. He has been denied parole multiple times. He has refused to provide DNA for updated testing. He has never publicly admitted to the murder. His next parole eligibility date falls in January 2027. The most haunting detail of the Cara Knott case is the testimony about what happened on that off-ramp before the murder. Multiple women described the same thing: being flagged over on the same stretch of I-15, being directed to the same dead-end off-ramp, sitting in their cars, while a uniformed highway patrol officer stood at their window and touched their hair and shoulders and said things that left them cold. They did not report him. He was law enforcement. He represented safety. He represented the authority you turn to when something went wrong. Cara Knott turned to him too. She pulled over because she was supposed to. Because pulling over for a police officer on a dark freeway is what responsible, law-abiding people do. The system that was supposed to protect her was the thing that killed her. Her father, Sam Knott, spent years working to reform California laws governing police conduct after women reported officers who had harassed them. He continued to visit the site where his daughter's body was found. On November 30th, 2000, Sam Knott died of a heart attack on that exact site, within yards of where Cara's body had been discovered in 1986. The location has since been designated as a memorial garden in Cara's name. The Cara Knott murder fundamentally changed how women responded to being pulled over by police in California. In the months following the case, a wave of incidents was reported as female drivers refused to stop for law enforcement, frightened, suddenly, by a trust that the case had taught them could be exploited. California subsequently developed protocols for women who felt unsafe during a traffic stop. including the practice of slowing down and calling 911, to verify that the officer is legitimate, before pulling over to a lighted public area. The bridge from which Paya threw Cara Knott's body has been renamed the Cara Knott Memorial Bridge. Craig Paya is still alive, still incarcerated at California Men's Colony in San Luis Obispo, still refusing to provide a DNA sample, still, by the official record, offering nothing. Cara Knott did everything right. She drove carefully. She obeyed the law. She pulled over when the lights came on. The system that was supposed to keep her safe decided, on a dark, dead-end road in December of 1986, that she was on her own. The bridge she was thrown from now carries her name. That is the city's answer, a name on a bridge and a man in a cell who still won't talk. Story 5, The Boulevard of the Dead, San Diego's Unsolved Serial Murders, and the Donna Gentile Conspiracy. She testified against police officers in June 1985. She told the world what she knew. She gave names. She even recorded a videotape of her suspicions and left it with her lawyer in case something happened to her. 5 weeks later, her body was found on a mountain road, arranged with a deliberateness that told investigators this was not random. Donna Gentile knew something about the San Diego Police Department, and someone in the San Diego Police Department, or close to it, knew exactly where to find her. El Cajon Boulevard, San Diego. Throughout the 1980s, this stretch of road through the mid-city neighborhoods was one of the primary streets where women engaged in street-level prostitution. The women who worked the boulevard were, in the language of the era, marginalized, poor, often struggling with addiction, living outside the safety nets that the city extended to its more visible residents. They were also, by the time investigators would eventually acknowledge it, dying in enormous numbers. Between 1985 and 1990, at least 43 women were murdered in San Diego County in circumstances that would eventually be grouped under the designation of the San Diego serial murders. Most were found strangled, beaten, discarded in alleys, dumpsters, irrigation ditches, and remote rural areas. Many had been raped. Several had their hands tied behind their backs with fragments of yellow hemp rope. Many were connected to El Cajon Boulevard. For 2 years, from 1985 to 1987, the San Diego Police Department and the San Diego County Sheriff's Department could not agree whether the murders were even connected. Donna Marie Gentile was 22 years old when her body was found on June 23, 1985, in a ravine off Sunrise Highway on Mount Laguna, 30 miles from downtown San Diego. She was the first chronological victim on the official list. She had been murdered with considerable care. No fingerprints were left, the tire tracks from the killer's vehicle had been methodically erased, and nothing had been stolen from her. She had not been sexually assaulted. The medical examiner found that parts of her clothing had been cut away without damaging the skin, a strange and meticulous detail that suggested her killer was someone who did not want to make mistakes. 5 weeks before her body was found, Donna Gentile had testified in a formal proceeding against 2 San Diego police officers. She alleged that Officer Larry Avrek had coerced her into becoming a police informant, then threatened to arrest her unless she provided him with sexual services. She had worked with a lawyer. She had made a videotape describing her suspicions and left it in the lawyer's possession. She had told people, clearly and specifically, that she was afraid. 5 weeks later, she was dead. An internal investigation by the San Diego Police Department eventually acknowledged that misconduct regarding prostitute informants was, in the department's own words, widespread in the mid-1980s. Multiple officers were suspended. For days, no one was ever charged with murder. The deaths kept coming throughout 1985, 1986, and 1987, accumulating at a rate that should have triggered an emergency response from the moment investigators first began to notice the pattern. Instead, the San Diego Police Department and the Sheriff's Department spent 2 years debating whether the cases were connected. By the time they officially acknowledged a serial murder crisis in late 1987, 19 women were already dead. A 12-member task force was finally formed in September 1988. One of their first decisions was to operate in near-complete secrecy. refusing media requests, refusing to enlist public help, refusing even to disclose where the task force was based. Ron Sims, an official who had helped coordinate the hunt for Seattle's Green River Killer, explicitly told San Diego investigators that this decision to work in secret would cost them years. He was right. Another victim entered the investigation at this point. Cynthia Main, 26 years old, who had also been a police informant. Like Donna Gentile, she had testified about police misconduct. Like Donna Gentile, she had provided names. Cynthia Main disappeared on February 21st, 1986. Her car was found abandoned in a restaurant parking lot. Her body was never found. She is still listed as a missing person. Her phone number was found written in Donna Gentile's personal effects after Donna's death. The most disturbing element of the San Diego serial murders is what might be called the conspiracy question, a question that the city's own internal investigation raised, examined, and then allowed to quietly expire without resolution. Investigators connected to the case alleged that two specific police officers, Lieutenant Carl Black and a former officer named Robert Hannibal, who had been fired in 1983 for beating prostitutes, were the killers of Donna Gentile. Acquaintances and prostitutes allegedly told investigators that the pair had openly discussed wanting Gentile dead before her murder. The then chief medical examiner, David Stark, classified the autopsy reports on Donna Gentile's body and never released them to the public. Stark was subsequently fired from his position for a separate but related reason. He had ordered the cremation of the remains of 4 murder victims without proper authorization, destroying critical forensic evidence in the process. No criminal charges were ever filed against Carl Black, Robert Hannibal, or any other police officer in connection with Donna Gentile's murder. The disciplinary findings against the officers involved in misconduct resulted in suspensions of between 10 and 20 days without pay. The San Diego serial murders were eventually attributed to multiple different killers, not one serial killer, but a collection of different perpetrators who happened to be hunting the same population of women during the same years. Several convictions were obtained for individual murders. The majority of the 43 cases have never been solved. As of 2023, they remain open cold cases. The internal investigation concluded in November 1991. Multiple officers had been disciplined for their conduct with prostitute informants. No one had been charged with murder. The full autopsy report on Donna Gentile remains classified. The videotape she left with her attorney, the one she made specifically in case something happened to her, became part of the public record when her lawyer released it to the media. In it, she described her fears, named names, and explained what she believed was happening to her. She was right about all of it. She was 22 years old. The most precise detail in the official account is this: Donna Gentile's body was found on a mountain road 30 miles from the city. Her killer, according to the evidence, had taken deliberate pains to leave nothing behind. No prints, no tire tracks, no signs of a struggle at the scene. The body was arranged. The clothing was cut. In a city where dozens of women were being beaten, strangled, and thrown into dumpsters on El Cajon Boulevard, the murder of Donna Gentile was a different kind of murder. Controlled, methodical, professional. What kind of person kills with that kind of discipline? And why was the autopsy report sealed? The surviving families of many of the 43 victims eventually came forward to describe a consistent experience with law enforcement. Police refusing to file missing persons reports, claiming the women's drug addictions or histories of prostitution made them low-priority cases. Parents learning about their daughters' deaths years later from newspaper articles, having never been contacted by investigators. A mother of one victim saying that when she tried to provide evidence, police lost it. The official investigation was closed on July 1, 1992. The task force was disbanded. Critics, including other law enforcement agencies, argued that the investigation had been deeply flawed from the beginning. The victims' families accused the police department of indifference, incompetence, and, in some cases, active obstruction. The investigation into who killed Donna Gentile and whether police officers were involved has never formally reopened. Donna Gentile made a videotape. She sat in front of a camera and she explained carefully and specifically, what she was afraid of and who she was afraid of. She left it with her lawyer. She walked out of that room, and 5 weeks later, she was dead on a mountain road, her killer leaving nothing behind. The tape exists. The names in it are in the public record. The autopsy report that might answer the most important question is still classified. Somewhere in the gap between what is known and what is sealed, the truth about what happened to Donna Gentile is waiting. And after 40 years, the city is still not giving it up. San Diego is beautiful. That is not in dispute. The ocean is real. The sunsets are real. The sense that you are living at the edge of something expansive and open is entirely real. The city did not invent its reputation for paradise. But cities are not just their coastlines. They are their histories. And history, unlike a travel brochure, cannot be curated. It can be buried, sometimes literally, as the people of El Campo Santo know. But it cannot be permanently concealed. It surfaces, in the footsteps that move through an old house on San Diego Avenue, in the cold case files that a detective opens 50 years after 3 children stopped coming home, in the memorial garden built by a father at the bottom of a bridge, in the classified autopsy report of a 22-year-old woman who was afraid enough to make a videotape, and afraid of exactly the right people. What these 5 stories share is not the supernatural. Not all of them involve ghosts, and none of them require you to believe in anything you cannot verify. What they share is something more unsettling: the consistent gap between what a city presents itself to be and what actually happened within it. San Diego presented order and got Craig Pyre. It presented progress and paved over its dead. It presented law and produced a task force that operated in secret while women died on its boulevards. The stories that survive from a city's history are the stories that refuse to stay buried. They survive because the people involved, the dead, their families, the witnesses, the investigators who stayed up at night, demanded that they be told. They survive because silence, no matter how official, is not the same as resolution. Whatever happened in the Whaley House, those heavy footsteps have been heard by too many separate people to dismiss entirely. Whatever moved through San Diego County in the summer of 1976, it has not been named. Whatever sealed Donna Gentile's autopsy report is still sealed. Some questions do not get answered. They just get older. And in a city that calls itself America's finest, they keep walking the halls long after the lights have gone out.